we will be taking just a touch under of an hour of your time this afternoon. I think we're going to be talking, you know, about risk assessment and what it is that auditors, specifically meaningful use auditors, are likely to be looking for when they're looking for what you did for your risk assessment. So this is based on a presentation that Holly and I did back in July for a group of CMS state Medicaid auditors, because they were a little bit unfamiliar with what constitutes a good SRA. And so we know for a fact that some of the things they'll be looking for will be the kinds of things that we're describing today. So I've been around this for a long, long time. You can probably tell there that I'm the sort of sour-faced looking one. It's not really a very good picture, and I'll apologize for that. But Holly is smiling in her picture, so we'll spend some time with you today, and hopefully you won't think that, man, what a sourpuss this guy is. So we're going to talk about a number of things today, and you know, we'll be bouncing back and forth between myself and Holly. Holly has a really solid background in HIPAA and quality. I'm more on the security side, but we're going to be spending this time on what the HIPAA security requirements are. In fact, especially after the omnibus, you know, what are those elements of an SRA that those auditors are looking for, and therefore what constitutes a good SRA, in our opinion. And then, again, what the auditors will be looking for in terms of evidence of requirement fulfillment. So as we get started with that, I think it's important to understand going forward, OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, is who is in charge of HIPAA enforcement, and they are ramping up efforts all the time. I mean, there is more money in their budget for auditing this year than has ever been in their budget before. They are hiring new staff to perform audits. They've had one round of preliminary pilot auditing that happened in 2012, and they learned from that. So they're understanding more about the things to look for, and they're coming. Those OCR audits are coming, as well as anybody who attests to meaningful use can expect to be looked at in a post-payment audit for the proper documentation and all the other elements, not only for SRA, but the other measures as well.
And Dan, I'm just going to jump in. Can you go ahead and advance the slides? We're still on the title slide. Make sure that's working for us.
Okay.
So I know I'm balancing lots of buttons here, so hopefully that'll move forward for us. Carol said she wants to see the grumpy picture, so that's kind of the goal here, is to see the sourpuss face, right,
okay.
Carol? If it doesn't work, I'll do one thing here to take over.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of struggling here. I've got an application that's got a window on top of the PowerPoint, and it won't allow me. Mine is jumping, yours is not.
Yeah, let's try it again here. Just say show your screen. I just gave you the power to showcase that. So when you click OK, we'll hopefully get caught up to where you are so that Carol can see the photo. Otherwise, Jan, you can also open it on your end, and if we need to go to your screen, we can do that while we're waiting here for him to open it up. Any luck sharing that, Dan?
No.
Oh, there we go. Yep, we're on the HHS Guidance now slide, so just go ahead and try going back one slide and make sure that works. Yep, and there's today's focus. Yep.
There's the sourpuss.
There we go, yeah. Now we got the grumpy face. I hope it lived up to your expectations, Carol. All right, yeah, sorry to jump in there. Keep going, Dan.
No. Thank you for pausing me, because obviously we weren't you weren't seeing what I was seeing. So you know, we're going to talk a little bit today about those elements of security risk analysis, and when we look at those focus areas, Holly will start us off with this, and this is where I'm going to turn this over to the very talented Holly Ahrens in our office.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Dan, and welcome everyone. I'm glad you're with us today. And I think this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in, and we're glad to share this information with you. We're going to first look at kind of understanding what the requirements are, because I think there is some confusion about what actually is required within HIPAA. So we're looking at really 45 CFR 164 and sections 302 through 318. So the main ones that talk about security risk analysis, the assessment, and the risk management program are listed here. Security management process, and under that topic is conduct a risk analysis, and then also create a risk management program. So those are required within the HIPAA security rule. Now this applies to all electronic PHI that's created, received, maintained, or transmitted by a covered entity or a business associate is subject to these rules. Okay, so let's be clear about that. And the requirement is that you have to conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, to the integrity, and the availability of ePHI that's held by the covered entity or the business associate. The second one is to create that risk management program that implements all the security measures to reduce those risks that you've identified in your assessment and those vulnerabilities to the most reasonable and appropriate levels that you can in your organization. Next slide, please. So HHS gives us some guidance on risk analysis and the requirements under a HIPAA security rule. And when this slide deck comes out to you or it's available to you, you can click on this title, HHS Guidance document. We won't do it right now, but it is available to you, and it gives full paragraphs of the topics we're going to talk about right here that I've just bulleted, and they identify what the scope of analysis should be, what type of data collection you should do, identifies and documents potential threats and vulnerabilities, and gives you some guidance on that. Assessing current security measures, you must determine what the likelihood of a threat would be, and then any potential impact that that threat might have. You must show that you've determined a level of risk. There must be finalized documentation, so like a final report, and you must do periodic reviews or updates to the risk assessment. So this is the guidance that HHS has given. And now, along with some of the things that we've seen in audits and just history and knowledge that Dan and I both have, we've combined that information and offering this information to you today. So really though, regardless of the method that you use to conduct an assessment, these are the things that we must make sure that we show in documentation. Next slide, please. But I want to make sure everyone understands that this is not just about a meaningful use objective to fulfill or a HIPAA rule that we have to comply with, that this really, risk management is foundational work. What you should see when you look at risk management is that it is holistic, and that meaning that it is across the entire organization that we would see the decrease of risks and that continual improvement to reduce risk is organizational wide. All of the work that you would do in risk management would always be tied to the organizational mission. So if you did have, and we're going to go through a risk management plan, in your plan, if you had a goal to ensure that all your policies were up to date and that they were reviewed, you would be able to tie that to some type of part of your organizational mission. And then risk management really is the foundation to, risk assessment is the foundation of risk management. So you can't have risk management without doing risk assessment. And if you can just click again, Jan, for me, or Dan. What we're striving for is this culture of compliance, where people in their jobs aren't thinking about regulations and they're not thinking about meaningful use objectives, but really it becomes second nature to protect the confidentiality and integrity and provide access to protected health information. So it is really changing the culture that you have in your organization, and we hope, and that's been our philosophy, that that is the approach that you take for this work. Next slide, please. So in creating that culture of compliance, and Daniel, yeah, you'll have to pop through these. The steps here are going to really mimic a quality circle. So you're required to conduct that risk assessment. That assessment then identifies weak spots and strengths that you have. It really is the driver of your risk management plan. The gaps that you find in the assessment will be addressed in that plan. The actions and plans that you outline will be then in policy and procedures, where you either change, create new policies and procedures, revise. Then you're going to retrain your workforce of these new changes or new policies and procedures so that they can demonstrate the changes that have been made. And then again, you go back through the circle, and again you assess to make sure those changes have taken place, and you continue to repeat this cycle. And that's why they require that you do a review or another risk assessment on an annual basis, and because it is a type of quality improvement project. Next slide.
So in looking at this, right, we're going to start to drill down a little bit now, and specifically, like Holly was saying, this is not only fundamental work and foundational work, but it's a way for you to manage risk entirely, and that's, from the risk management perspective, what's important here. So that culture of compliance, making sure you're doing the things you're supposed to be doing when you're supposed to be doing them, is a critical aspect here, as opposed to just making sure that we can check the box, right? Because, and that comes out when you start talking about some of the details of the risk assessment piece. Now, HHS and OCR have been very adamant, as CMS, that they aren't going to try to dictate a methodology for security risk assessment. So they have never said that there is a specific methodology that must be followed, and there are a number of them out there. ISO 27001, NIST has its own in the 800 series. There's a whole bunch of vendors out there that have proprietary formulas. ONC and OCR have developed a tool. But as we look across this landscape, you really have to see and fit what fits in your environment. And we start to see certain things that sort of rise to the top, right? And there are elements of these various risk analysis methodologies that are really critical to the process. So, there's a lot of varying opinions out there about what is necessary from a risk assessment process. I think as an industry and as guiding and directional groups, we've kind of come to a consensus that the checklist mentality is not adequate. That's something that early on was felt was probably pretty good. Not to say we shouldn't use checklists at all, but a checklist in and of itself doesn't provide all of the elements that are needed to conduct a thorough and accurate risk assessment. So when you're out there, it doesn't matter from a risk management or a risk assessment point of view, whether you're doing qualitative analysis, whether you're doing quantitative analysis, whether you're doing a hybrid approach, whether it's a Delphi technique where you haul all the right people into the room that know the answers to the questions. The common elements there are they have to be thorough. Whatever you do has to be thorough, and whatever you do has to be analyzed, right? So as we look more into this more deeply and what constitutes analysis, that's where the rubber meets the road in a risk analysis process. There's a lot of preparatory steps. There's a lot of document gathering. There's a lot of policy review. There's a lot of moving through spaces to see if policy is being followed. All of those add up to basically inputs into some kind of an analysis process. And it's critical that when you say you're conducting a thorough and accurate risk analysis, that you have that analysis portion outlined. What do these things mean, right? So when you start looking at analysis, you have to understand some of the basics of that analysis process. In the particular case that we're talking about here, we're talking about PHI and more specifically EPHI as being the asset that you're trying to protect. So as we get a little further into this, we'll see it's critically important to the process that we get an accurate and thorough inventory of where PHI is stored, maintained, and transmitted, and how that happens. So that's one of the elements that we're going to talk about is how do you identify those things, right? So any particular asset, whether it's your practice management software, whether it's your EMR, whether it's your PACS system, or your radiology, or your lab environment, whatever it is, those things are all treated as assets. And in generic terms, the things you have to understand before you can do an analysis is you have to understand what is the threat to that asset, right? What things are likely to happen to it, or what things could potentially happen to it. Is that asset vulnerable in some way? Is there something wrong that would make that vulnerable to a threat? And then, and importantly to your risk management plan, what mitigation steps are in place currently, and what mitigation steps should we be putting into place, right? So at the heart of an analysis, you have to understand where your PHI is, and then you have to understand the threats, you have to understand the vulnerabilities of those assets, and you have to understand what you are doing. Those are the common elements that are the heart of risk analysis. So we tend to think there are 3 or 4 pretty strong points here that need to be brought out in order to get to the heart of those elements. First one being the interview process. And I encourage all of you, whether you set up internal interviews, if you're doing your own risk assessment work, or if you're looking at vendors to provide this for you, make sure that you're aware of how they deal with the interview process, how they deal with the asking of the questions, right? There are some tools out there that all vendors in that space should be able to look to for guidance for what auditors are going to be looking for, right? And that is essentially whatever the interview questions should be based on the OCR audit protocol. That's one of the things that you can ask any vendor if you're going to talk to them about doing security risk assessment work for you. Is this based on OCR audit protocols? And if you don't get an affirmative answer, or if you see that they don't understand what you're talking about, you may want to look elsewhere as a vendor. So, you know, now this interview process really starts to get to the heart of a lot of the questions, and there can be hundreds of questions potentially. I think in NIST's tool, their HIPAA Security Research Toolkit, there is roughly 500 questions for small clinics, but there's about 800 questions for larger facilities like hospitals. ONC has developed a tool. It has 155 questions. You know, the tool that we use is somewhere in between those. It's a little bit adaptive. It can range from 200 to 300 questions. But these are designed to get the right people in the room to ask the questions to. So I think that's an important part of risk assessment is that interview process. So as we look at the next piece, so there will be an interview of some kind. As part of that interview process, there are bound to be asset inventory questions. And asset inventory, I can't stress this enough. If there's a takeaway from my side of this presentation, it's about this PHI inventory. You have to really understand and be very accurate on what types of PHI you have on your systems, who has access to it, where it's at, is it hardware or software based, what is the criticality of that? Not everything has the same level of critical nature if it goes down. You have to understand what security controls are put in place to protect these assets. It always has to be updated, as Holly was saying, going forward. You want to make sure that when you put in new systems or you implement them, you say, how does this affect us over the long haul, right? So, it's always good to bring in, if you can, an objective set of eyes, either from another department in your organization or from some outside entity. Your local regional extension centers are all versed in risk assessment, and they can be very valuable assets. If you go to those regional extension centers and ask some of these questions, they can help through these. And that objective set of eyes is probably a good idea, certainly from the auditor's perspective. If an organization says, well, we had an independent somebody come in, you'll want to cross that bridge if you can. The most difficult part of putting this thing together, you're going to find, is understanding the threats, right? What are the threats to these things? I mean, it's fairly simple to put together your list of assets, but what kinds of threats are there to these assets? And there are some resources out there. Terra is a good one. It's sponsored by Intel and a number of other industry providers. It's basically a way to get, Terra stands for Threat Agent Risk Assessment, and it attempts to document and prioritize threats to individual assets. NIST also has a list. Those threat agents, those can all be found in NIST 800-30, Appendix D. If you're not familiar with the 800 series, that is NIST's kind of seminal work on what constitutes risk assessment, and there's lots of good information in those NIST documents, starting with NIST 800-30. So, site walkthroughs. We also think that that's important because, when you do the questions and when you do the review of policy and you're doing the inventory, and those are all things that organizationally are supposed to happen, right? With the emphasis on supposed to happen. Now, things can be written in policy and affirmed that you have met the safeguard because you have the policy in place, but you should really do walkthrough to ensure that those things are actually being done, because especially with on-site audits, and OCR has additional money in their budget for ongoing on-site audits that they didn't do. They did a lot of desk audits in the first round. They're going to do more on-sites. And you just want to make sure that your policies and procedures are being followed in the clinical side of things and in the organizational side of things, so that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and as importantly, what you say you're doing, right? So that walkthrough is an important element of that, and it allows you to get some more of the data collected, and that data collection is a pretty important aspect of this too. So it really speaks to this walkthrough, this site walkthrough, really speaks to data collection and evidence.
Well, I'm a real mystery buff, and it's probably part of why I am in this industry, and because I'm always asked the question why, or where's the evidence or the documentation to support it. And really that's the framework of the mind of the auditor as well, because they're going to be asking, just like Dan had said, they're going to be asking for evidence that you did an assessment, evidence of an inventory that you know the threats that are out there. Next slide. So let's talk about that. How do we show this documentation if an auditor did happen to grace our doorways or send us a lovely email that we're being audited? It's really about final documentation. The report that you would receive from a third-party vendor or the report that would be generated by one of your staff is very important. And there's some elements there that you want to make sure you have, or if you are vetting a vendor, then you want to make sure that these things would be part of their final report. Specifically, it needs to be dated because we know that we have to have this done on an annual basis or have a review done. So we have to ensure that our dates are accurate when the assessment was done. Please ensure that it identifies your organization and all of the sites that they potentially had looked at or did look at in this assessment. So make sure those are identified. You want to make sure that they have identified the risks that were identified and analyzed. So it should be very clear in the report what risks were identified and analyzed. And then also when they give you those risks, to say categorically, how are we organizing them? So are these high, medium, lows? Or are these, you know, priority, mid-priority, low priority? However they determine that there are some type of prioritization and some categories for these risks. And then, because that's going to aid you when you are developing your risk management plan. So what if the final report hasn't been created at the time of your attestation or at the time of the audit, but you know that it's been done? What you do, just ask for a draft report to be sent. Most vendors do this very regularly to let you review it. Also, you could contact your vendor to verify those dates and have them provide a letter. And if they don't have the final report done by the time you attest, it might be a good idea that you ask your vendor for that letter. Next slide. So what if you're doing, it's your year to do a review or an update? Well, we want to make sure that you understand that it's not just annually that you should be doing these reviews or updates. It is when significant changes to your informational system environment or organizational changes happen that you then do a review or an update, because they will want to see that has occurred as well. So let's say you take on a whole new vendor for firewall and security services, then they would want to see that you have updated your security risk assessment by that change. Also, if you update your EHR to the new 2014 version, you would do another security risk assessment to ensure that you are reviewing the risks to the new software or the new hardware that you have that is significant. So to show your documentation of a review, obviously the date, you should be referencing those previously identified risks and show the progress that you've made on those, or potentially the lack of progress. And there should be some type of action in those for those that you've already previously identified. And if you have new risks that were identified in the review or the update assessment, you would put those in as well. It probably wouldn't be as extensive as the original assessment, but it will clearly identify previously identified risks and new risks. Next slide. Dan, did you want to talk about this, or you want me to go ahead? You may be on mute, Dan.
Oh, I apologize. I was on mute. Trying to make too many things happen at once. I apologize. So let's delve into that a little bit deeper. Holly, you have a couple of good points there. specifically about those risks and how do you show progress, right, from when the initial assessment is conducted to the review and that cycle, and how do you keep track of your progress? It all starts with that asset inventory or PHI inventory, and that really sets the tone for the rest of the document. I mean, because that asset inventory, it's what sets the scope, right? I mean, you are going to conduct analysis on these items, and those are the items that you need to conduct the analysis on, right? So you need to make sure that that's thorough, and it's all of the PHI and all of the identifying, you know, the standard terminology, right, is where it's created, stored, or transmitted, or maintained, and any place that PHI can be or it can move out of or into. So those are things to be thinking about when you're thinking about asset inventory or PHI inventory. You need to list all those systems. And it really, for it to be good, we believe that it really needs to be able to identify some of those things we talked about earlier. The asset inventory needs to, we'll look at an example here in just a moment, but you need to have a way to identify vulnerabilities. You need to identify what safeguards are in place, and that speaks to the mitigation piece. You need to understand how likely this thing is if there's something that could happen to it. Obviously, in South Dakota, in the middle of the country, we are less prone to earthquakes and certainly less prone to hurricanes, but we have other weather events that could disrupt service, right? And no one today, I mean, as community health system shows, no one is immune to attacks from the internet. If you have internet-connected systems, and we all do today, you are potentially at risk from foreign countries, in fact. China is thought to be a serious player in community health systems breach. So that affected 4.6 million people. But that can happen just as easy here in South Dakota as it can happen to a coast. It can happen in a small organization or a large organization. So it's really important for you to understand how this can happen and what the likelihood and what happens if it does happen to me. So, and then we also like to see some kind of a risk rating or an urgency score so that you have a way to prioritize your risk management strategy, right? You have to understand it. You have to do the analysis so that ultimately you can score it. This is a sample asset inventory, and we're not going to go through this point by point, but this one does show how you begin to build the process, right? Where you identify a system, you identify whether it contains PHI or not. You say who is responsible for this system. It helps you identify that, whether it's a vendor or an employee. And if it's an employee, what department, who is actually in charge of that, right? So then you have to start analyzing a little bit more about the likelihood of an event happening. You know, what kind of impact does it happen? You know, clearly practice management and clinical systems have different impacts if things go down. You have real-time systems and non-real-time systems. You have to be able to identify some way what happens if something happens here, right? And so then you do some math, you do some probabilities of identified happenings. The next section of this, though, is really about, do I have administrative or physical or technical or possibly all three or a combination that helps mitigate the risk to that asset? And again, we think that that's an important it's an important thing from analysis perspective to understand your existing mitigations as well as what potential threats are out there. How good a job are you doing protecting the asset, right? So, and ultimately, you end up with some kind of score. Now, what I want to get across here is not that you have to use a table like this, not that you have to use this table, but you have to get something that's workable in your organization, and it has to be thorough and accurate, and it has to have some way, which is the yellow column on this sheet, of prioritizing where you're going to expend your time, energy, money in the future, because that's managing risk, right? So you have to be able to understand where everything is, and you have to also understand what you're doing and where to place future efforts. So we tend to build that risk rating score, and there are multiple ways to do this, lots of different techniques for doing it, and we happen to think some are better than others, but we know that there are a lot of them that are acceptable in terms of methodology, but they should in some way really be able to tie together the asset and then what might happen to it and what is the impact if that thing does happen, and then what am I doing to mitigate that. Now you'll see on this slide that we're not really talking about mitigation at this point, because mitigation really speaks to the vulnerability. If you have an asset that isn't vulnerable at all, it's thought to be completely mitigated. If you look at an asset that has a whole bunch of vulnerabilities to it, well, then you might have to take active steps to mitigate things. But the key point here is making sure you have some way of understanding how you rate the risk for that particular asset.
All right, so once we have analyzed that risk and we have identified there is some type of risk, like Dan said, we have to mitigate it. And because the scores show some type of urgency, like Dan said, that is the driver then to create your risk management plan. So we've fulfilled one requirement. We've done conducted a thorough and accurate assessment by what we went through the PHI inventory. We've analyzed our risk. We've identified scores. Now the second requirement is to develop the risk management plan. So we take those risks that were identified, high, medium, and low, or however they're categorized, and we put them in some type of format that's going to work for you. I especially like the Excel spreadsheets for this type of work, because I can add to it, I can do some formulas, things like that. And you're going to assign someone who's responsible for this mitigation strategy. So let's say we'll go with the policies and procedures again. So we've identified that we don't have a policy and procedure of who is the HIPAA security and privacy officer for your organization. So this is going to be a high, identified as high, because you want to make sure policies and procedures are in place. So you'll develop an action plan. So at this point, you bring together people who are involved in this type of work in your organization. So it may be an executive team, it may be your, health services team, it may be just the CEO and the quality manager, whoever those people are that would be involved in this work, and you build an action plan. So then you set dates and say, okay, in 3 months we're going to have draft policy for this. So you make sure you put in those goal dates, and from the time you've identified the risk to the time of the goal that has been resolved, you should show action. And this is very important to ensure that you have formal documentation about actions that have been taken. We have been in different types of organizations, and they have had either a meaningful use audit or a HIPAA audit, and they've done their assessment, but then there was no documentation after that on what they did. So we had to help them collect, because we knew they did work, so we had to help them collect emails, meeting minutes, different type of vendor quotes, that type of thing, and bring that together to show what actions were taken. And I can tell you it's much easier if you document that at the time it's happening. So let's say you discuss these policies at the med staff meeting. Whoever's responsible for this risk management plan or this particular goal would then just enter that. So it may be a shared document. I think one thing we want to make sure we understand in all of this, that these are not static documents. The asset inventory or the PHI inventory is not a static document. It changes as your environment changes. Same as the risk management plan. These are living documents that change as you take action or don't take action, because at some point you may say, you know what, we can't afford this particular security software, so we're going to put it on for next budget year in 2016, something like that. But you show that you've actually addressed it, something's been done about it, and we're going to continue to look at it in the future. So next slide, please. This is a sample, and again, there is no perfect way to do this. You'll find what works for you best, but you can see this is one that I use, and it's just a template, and I show the risk that was identified. And like we had said before, in your report you get from a vendor, it should be very clear what the risk is. The level of risk, so they've categorized it to be a high. The date it was identified. Who's responsible? So you've gotten your group to set together to say, okay, quality manager's in charge of this, or the risk manager is. Your strategy. So the risk manager in this particular example is going to write policy and procedure. We hope to have this done by December 1st. Here's the actions that have been taken at this point, and they didn't have a resolve date yet on this particular sample. So this, again, just a template, just an example for you. You can do it in any way that works for you. Next slide. And when we talked about this being holistic, it should be like a web. When this happens, when you do an assessment, you start your risk management plan, you should start seeing this seeping out into your organization like a web. So you've done the SRA. Now, it should be very visible in your organization that it was done, so it is communicated out to all levels of the organization. There should be now policy and procedure changes. Go ahead and click through, Dan. There should be training events now that we see as we progress through this.
Scott, you might have to do your magic again, because I have a pop-up window and I can't move it.
Well, Scott will help us. Okay, I'll keep going. There should be an update to policy and procedures. You should see memos going out. You should have different training events. Documentation and personnel files will be updated that people have attended mandatory trainings. And as all of this continues through your organization, there will be evidence of your risk assessment throughout the entire organization. So it should never just sit at like an organizational, administrative, or executive level, and that's where it ends. This thing will spread out into your whole organization, and that's why it's very important that you approach this work, as we said, as foundational work, and that it's holistic. It is not just a one department type of work.
So Dan, I sent that over to you. If you want to share your screen, it might catch up. Otherwise, we can have Jan jump ahead in her presentation to the same place and catch up there.
I think that I'm there, but if you're not seeing a change.
Yeah, we just need you to click share my screen underneath screen sharing.
There it goes.
Yeah.
That works better.
Perfect.
Sorry for me creating more technical.
No, you're great.
So, sort of to wrap this up, well, I'm going to leave it on this screen for just a moment because, for any of you who might be jotting down what Holly was just talking about there. There, your time's up, though. To wrap this up in terms of getting a little bit of time for some questions. I think the theme that shows through this all is what auditors will be looking for and what you should be doing because it's the right thing to do is make sure that what you're doing is comprehensive and thorough, right? It's not a place to be cutting corners, although many times it feels like it is, because you're guessing about what might or might not happen, and that's a very difficult thing to do. But it needs to be done because the old adage is after the horse is out, there's not much point in closing the barn door. Well, once you get on the wall of shame at HHS, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, if you have a breach affecting more than 500 individuals, you get put on HHS's wall of shame, it's called, and you're publicly identified as having had a breach. So, if it happens, it's too late. So you want to make sure you're trying to do the things to keep it from happening. Clearly, from an auditor's perspective, you want to make sure that it's accurate and thorough. You want to make sure that it's finalized, right? Partway through the process is probably not good enough. If you can convince an auditor that we're nearly done, well, that's a question to have or a conversation to have with your auditor. But you should make sure that this thing is periodically reviewed, and Holly stressed that a number of times. These have to be living documents. They have to be reworked when there are system changes, and that might be more than annually. At least reviewing these documents should be. So with that, I think we probably got about 10 or 11 minutes left for questions. So we'd encourage the questions. I mean, I think when we do this presentation, the questions really bring out what people are thinking about and can foster some good discussion.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here. So if you have a question, feel free on the GoToWebinar control panel under questions to type it in, and then we'll relay that to Dan and Holly so that they can take those questions up. And I think, you talked about giving this presentation in a few months back. So as we're getting the first questions in here, Dan, what's kind of the most common reaction you get from people who hear this presentation? Is it fear? Is it relief that they know what to do? Or what are you kind of getting from people who hear this information?
Well, and Holly can answer this too, but I think what I'm getting as feedback is, if you're sort of dragging this out into the light, right, and it's not nearly the black art that people think it is when they hear security risk assessment or risk management, they tend to think of it as something that is almost voodoo-like in some cases. But there are some very good tools that make it available to you, and it's about doing it and finding somebody that you trust to work with you to do it. So we've seen a lot of folks saying with that comment of, "Oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it might be."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about you, Holly? What have you heard or feedback that you've gotten?
Well, I think we definitely hear quite a bit of fear because people didn't realize that they should have been doing this. HIPAA's been around since 2003, and the security rules in effect in 2005. So, this is not really new information, and I just think that people didn't realize, and I'm not sure why, and it may be the lack of enforcement that OCR had going on back then, but there is some fear out there, and I think it's a welcome change for someone to stand up and say, okay, this is what you should do in terms of having the elements, because I think it is somewhat ambiguous from the regulation perspective of how you should be showing what you've done. And they don't release those audit documents to say what the auditors will be looking for. But I think it's safe to say that we've tried to give information to try and quell some of the fears that may be out there, and just help people realize that this, like Dan said, it's not as bad as you may think. And sometimes getting through the questions might be the worst part, but it's not, like he said, this magical thing. People will be looking at your system and all this stuff. It's really about figuring out where the information is. So we, we just don't know at this point. Sometimes that's where all the fear comes from. But great question, Scott.
Yeah. Well, and a reminder, you can definitely throw your own questions in the GoToMeeting control panel. Just type it in the questions section, and we'll make sure to ask those as well. So probably here to Dan or Holly, either one here. What have you seen most typically when you've done the assessments? Because you've kind of talked about what you need for an assessment, but I know that HealthPOINT also provides some services. So what have you typically seen when people actually go through these questions and steps?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that first, Dan. And what we see mainly is the lack of policies and procedures that are required through HIPAA regulations. And that is a pretty easy fix. And it is just getting those policies together and making sure that people are trained on them. Because I think we all kind of thought, oh, I've got my HIPAA manual up on the shelf for the past 10 years, but no one's looked at it, no one's reviewed it. And really these need to be, like we said, if you want to create that culture of compliance, it needs to be top of the mind type of stuff. So this is not something you put on the shelf and you're done with it, and this needs to be something that you see on a daily basis. And HIPAA does address that, and it's like regular security reminders. That could be a monthly thing or a daily thing, reminding staff that we need to keep PHI very secure and confidential. So I think policies is the number one thing. Probably the other would be that, who's responsible for all of this, and then also the lack of a PHI or an asset inventory within the organizations. I would say those are probably my top three, and Dan, I'll let you answer as well.
No, I would echo all of those. One of the things that we see a lot with policy and policy development is as Holly described, there was an initial push. HIPAA was coming in 2003. It was actually, it was from '96, but in 2003 was sort of the big push, right? And then the security rule in 2005, and people did a lot of work initially, and then it sort of became what has been described as a toothless tiger for a number of years, right? And with that no enforcement action component to that, people became a little lackadaisical in how they were updating these policies. So, we're seeing policies that might have been great policies in 2006, but have zero correlation with what's actually happening in a place today. You think about the how bring your own devices has moved into the space, and how iPads and different tablet configurations change how you have to deal with things on a day-to-day. That policy from 2006 just isn't going to cover that. Mm-hmm. So that needs to be worked, and so those policies are really strong. And the other thing I would echo Holly saying is, boy, those PHI inventories, we see it pretty consistently that once you start peeling away layers of that onion, places have PHI in a lot more locations than they initially think they do.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And just for the attendees, so you'll be able to access these slides. And as Holly mentioned, there's some nice links on there. You can go ahead and click and get some resources. So just so you know that. One of the questions we had here was someone who's having a new employee starting soon. They're wondering if they should wait to do an SRA or if they should do it now anyway. Is there key employees that need to be in place before they get started?
No, they should go ahead. In terms of employees in place, no, go right ahead, because really the assessment is a snapshot in time, and you always want to know where you are at that moment, and you need a place to start. So I would not wait, and because it's not a look at perfection. No one is perfect. Okay, this is not to say, oh, we've attained, we're at the pinnacle of the mountain of security. It is just to highlight, okay, where are those gaps, and then address the gaps. And there is no shame in that. That is what you want to do, is identify gaps and find as many as you can and mitigate them to the lowest level possible.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
I,
Yeah.
I might have
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
caveat, and that would be is if that employee, if you happen to be looking for a risk manager or a compliance officer, and you think you're a long ways into that process, it might be worthwhile to wait, but you're not hurting anything by doing it now.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No, that's great. And I was just going to mention that if there are more resources available at healthpoint.dsu.edu, including articles on a lot of the topics discussed today. So we'll include that in the email that goes out to attendees. So just any final thoughts from Dan or Holly as we sign off here? If not, that's
Go
fine
ahead,
too.
Dan.
no, final thoughts, just get it started. Start doing it. It'll become more natural all the time.
Yep, perfect. And Laura asked if we'll be sending out the recording. So we'll send the recording with the slides if people like that. So you'll have access to both. And obviously feel free to share it with other people who are in industries that might require an SRA so that they can learn as well. So we just want to thank everyone for attending. It's great to have you here. Always feel free to reach out to Dan or Holly. Their email addresses are there on the screen with specific questions. They'd love to help you out teaching you more or helping providing some of these services as well. We'll be in touch with an email, and until then, we hope that you have a great day. Bye-bye, everyone.